So my name's Maria Balinska, and I'm the executive director of the US-UK Fulbright Commission. And what makes this session a bit different is that this is a VE COIL that was established because of an award and a competition to bring together professors from the US and the UK to create a virtual exchange. And just to, I mean, for those of you who weren't here this morning, I want to summarize the fact that we established we launched a competition in 2021, which was for professors in the US and in the UK to apply to take part in a to co-design and co-teach a virtual exchange with a professor in the other country. And we had on offer 3 pairs of awards. So the idea was, we would put together for each pair a professor from the US, a professor from the UK, and that each of them would create a virtual exchange in an existing course. So, but the existing course would need to have something to do with one of 3 global challenges. Because as you'll recall from this morning, our awards are called the Global Challenges Teaching Awards. And so one pair of awards was looking at climate change, one at pandemics and public health, and one at racial justice. And what was very exciting about this was, despite the fact that we had not that much time to advertise for applications, and the fact that the application process was even more onerous and long than a Fulbright process, we actually had 75 applications. We had 75 applications from the US and the UK. We had applications from Ivy League schools. We had applications from community colleges, from land grants, from small liberal arts colleges, and in the UK, from both what are called Russell Group universities and post-1992. So, and again, from across the regions of the UK, which was really important. So from Scotland, from England, from Wales, and from Northern Ireland. Our inaugural cohort of faculty started their work, their training, and that was a key. And just to quickly summarize the benefits that the faculty got, on top of a travel grant to visit each other's campuses, an honorarium for their work on top of everything else that we've been hearing a lot about how much extra work this is, so we gave a small honorarium. We had a technical fee to the universities to help with setting up these virtual exchanges, if that would be helpful. But this sort of, the best part of it was, sitting right next to me, was the 6-week training course in COIL with Veronica, who was at the time at ACE, and her colleague, John Fowler, and then mentoring across the rollout of the course. So I wanted just to give you that sort of overview before I have our panelists introduce themselves, because I think that just in terms of the timing, having applied in 2021, the training took place in the spring of 22, and the courses, the virtual exchanges were introduced into the courses in the autumn of 2022. So there's been time to reflect on what worked, what didn't work, and again, we're going to spend some time about the award and competition part of it. But first of all, I just want to stop talking myself and ask our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and also just to say before this award, how much time they had actually, how much knowledge they had of COIL and VE. So maybe if we start with Staci.
Sure. Hi. I'm Dr. Staci Strobl in the Department of Criminal Justice here at Shenandoah. And at the time that I applied, I was a newbie. I was in the Shenandoah University training that we offer, and I was planning to do a COIL, which I ended up doing with a professor at Yarmouk. So shout out to the Yarmouk crowd. And so for me, I had high aspirations and just decided to throw my hat in the ring on something even bigger. It was a little premature, but it worked out anyway.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Sammie Buzzard. I'm a lecturer in climate science at Cardiff University in the UK. And my work focuses a lot on the polar regions aspect of climate change, so how fast our ice is melting and other depressing things like that. And before this, I'd never heard anything about virtual exchange, if I'm honest. I saw the award advertised. I thought this sounds really exciting and it's something I wanted to try out for my students. And fortunately that happened.
And Veronica.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to also try to clear up some acronyms. I'm here representing both the American Council on Education and the American Association for Colleges and Universities, both based in Washington, D.C. So my journey into the world of virtual exchange and collaborative online international learning began technically back in 2017. Before joining ACE, I had the privilege of working with the Fulbright U.S. and Visiting Scholar Program overseeing the East Asia and Pacific Rim region at the Institute of International Education. And during that time, I saw many Fulbright scholars coming back from their grants and thinking creatively of ways to stay connected with their colleagues and with their students, even after they returned. But it wasn't until I joined the American Council on Education that I realized there was this whole field dedicated to this type of continued online exchange we had been reading about in the reports. So my introduction to virtual exchange and COIL at ACE was very hands-on and dynamic. Within 3 weeks of being hired, I was asked to create, implement, and oversee the first pilot of what was to be called the US-Japan COIL initiative. And this initiative was aimed to strengthen higher ed ties between the United States and Japan using this virtual exchange COIL method. Over the 5 years, with support from the US Embassy Tokyo, Japan's Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, we were able to achieve some pretty incredible successes. A total combined investment of $5.6 million helped establish 70 US and 27 Japanese higher education institutions, establish over 60 new partnerships impacting 1,000 faculty, 750 staff, and over 15,000 students. So yes, you can see that was a deep dive to my introduction to virtual exchange and COIL. And then of course the global pandemic hit, and that completely changed the landscape. We were receiving requests from various entities, including the US Embassy in Caracas, US Embassy in Quito, to adapt a similar initiative. And then thus we were also introduced to the US-UK Fulbright Commission and also the foreign government of Norway. So we're right now continuing our work with AAC&U in this space, and we're proud to partner with Maria and her team at the Commission to continue.
Thanks, Veronica. So let's start at the beginning and ask again, Sammie and Staci, I mean, what motivated you to apply for this award? And I do want to underline, and you might explain how much you had to do to apply for it, because you did have to gather quite a lot of materials.
So as I just said, I hadn't heard of virtual exchange before. So when this came round in an email at my university, I think it really piqued my interest because it was something that we weren't doing at all at Cardiff. So it seemed like something new and innovative and exciting. But particularly from the climate change aspect of it, I thought this seems great because while it's wonderful that lots of students do get to go and study abroad, there's obviously a big carbon cost to that. And there's a big financial cost as well. And this is a way that they can get some of those experiences. Okay, so it's not the same, but they're still going to get a lot of really great experiences without having to bear those carbon and monetary costs of traveling. I think also because we were very much coming out of the pandemic in the UK at the time this award was first advertised, I think that my students just needed something a bit different. They were all great at being on Zoom and doing things virtually, so I wasn't worried about that aspect, but they weren't getting those kind of experiences. They were doing a lot of studying from their bedrooms, seeing the same people every day. So it's a way to kind of break them out of their normal schedules and do something a bit more exciting, that because they'd lost a lot of those opportunities to do in-person exchanges because of the pandemic.
My motivation was really around trying to make my environmental and wildlife crime course a little bit more interdisciplinary than I could make it as one professor. I've done some work on the social impacts of climate change on particular communities, but when I was presenting to students, of course they're really worried about climate change. It's one of the most pressing issues of our time. And in terms of the sort of scientific, physical phenomenon, I had this like middle school infographic and couldn't really talk about the intensity, how much planning is needing, what is going to happen. I was really working mostly with the effects of disasters on communities and first responders like police, but also my students are interested in, from the criminal justice point of view, do we have carbon criminals? Do we need to blame, for example, oil companies or other, industrial entities for the problem to begin with? So, on the front and the back end, but the phenomenon itself, I felt like I wasn't able to go deeper. So I really was looking, and in my application, I specifically put, hey, give me a real scientist, not just a social scientist. I shouldn't say that to the social scientists in the room, that we're not real, but you know what I mean, a hard scientist. And so that I could really deliver on the interdisciplinary nature of what we're working with.
I see that both of you have avoided saying what the application was like. I wondered if you could say a bit about it, because at the time we felt a bit bad because we were asking you to do so much, but could you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, there was some normal sort of paper, short answer / essay kinds of things. And if I recall, we also had to turn in some teaching project. And I turned in a video of me teaching, which was a very poor quality. Apologies that you had to look at that. It was me in front of a Zoom camera, weirdly angled. But I think what you're referring to was the very hair-raising thing that we needed to go through where, and let me see if I can get this right, we were put together with other competitors for the grant into a Zoom, and we were going to be given a question that we had to answer collectively. We'd never met each other, and we had to work together to answer this question. Now, what was happening on the other end were there these black boxes of people who were the judges of how all of us who were going for this grant cooperated with each other. So it was very, very hair-raising for me. We weren't sure exactly what folks that were judging this were looking for. And so it was one of those situations where you're like, do I take over this whole conversation? Do I hang back? How do I engage in a way that shows that I might be the right candidate for the award? So I'll turn to Sammie for her to explain more.
But I think you covered most of it there, Staci. But yeah, I'll just echo what Staci was saying around how it was a very different process to anything I've applied to before, and especially kind of having that group interview situation where we were being watched was certainly unusual. But we spoke a bit about this yesterday in our session when we were preparing for this panel. And I think that something that came out of that was we felt, well, maybe it's good that we were uncomfortable and put in a situation that maybe it was a little unexpected, because that's kind of good preparation for the COIL, actually. There's always going to be stuff that comes up that you have to deal with while you're doing the COIL, and doing like a small version of that also maybe gave us a sense of, is this something that we actually want to do? Because maybe if that situation made you really uncomfortable, maybe you didn't want to do a virtual exchange. So.
Well, thank you for setting up that so well, because, on our end, we got 75 applications. And actually, I guess I thought you might also talk about the fact that you really needed to get quite a lot of documentation from leadership at the university. And you needed to nominate an administrator from the university who would also take part in Veronica and John's training. But I'm going to hand over to Veronica just to say, how we came up with this exercise, which we all agree was a bit creepy. Veronica and I were two of the 6 blank screens on the Zoom, listening in and watching. But Veronica, over to you in terms of, we had to choose 6 out of 75, and then we had to start thinking about how we would pair them up.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think everybody who's ever been through a review process and has to eliminate that many know that it can be very challenging. But one of the key aspects that we were looking at, and I just want to emphasize and preface, so our the institute that we run is, we call it 2 tracks. So it's not just faculty going through professional development. We're looking for also identified international education administrators and or academic affairs officers to also participate in the professional development in parallel. And the tracks overlap. And we find that this is really important when we look at candidates. On paper, it's one thing to look at and review commitments, right? But it's another thing to see what that actually plays out in reality once you ask them to give up a couple of hours a week to join their colleagues, many of whom they've never interacted with within their campus, to engage in conversations and think more deeply about this work. And so from our end, one of the criteria we looked at was, yes, the institutional context for which there was to support the faculty to meet the award program goals. And also from the faculty angle of what we're looking at, these qualities that indeed are really relevant for global collaborations, especially online. And that's things that the main skills we were assessing in that group activity were really for active listening, adaptability, effective communication, consensus building, and leadership. These are the things that I know you're measuring in your students. You need to model it, right, for your students. So it was really important and critical that we try to simulate as best as we can a mini COIL exercise so we can truly see the candidates and be able to then matchmake the faculty and across disciplines, no less. So it was a bit challenging, but we felt, I think ultimately, and I hope it was perceived, there was this holistic approach that later on, once I believe you were selected, I'm hoping you felt there was some aha moments of why we did it in reflection. But
Are there any lessons learned, do you think, Veronica, from that first time out?
Sure. Well, it's really about balancing, right, all of these qualities. To be flexible and to show leadership at the same token. It really is a true balancing act. And so from our end, it just reinforced the value of having to pick diverse perspectives in a VE COIL project and the need for making sure we're picking individuals who can really facilitate having this inclusive third space for their students. So they need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so this was our lesson learned, that we needed to find that careful balance of someone who can make decisions, but also be an active listener, know when it was time to pull back, lean forward, that dichotomy. So that was definitely our takeaway from that application process.
Thank you. So we got these 3 pairs. And so now the time came to work together. And of course, unlike the exchanges that we have been talking about for the rest of the day, we had one language here. But the classic quote about the US and the UK is it's 2 countries divided by 1 language. And I think some of that came out in the building of these exchanges. But Sammie and Staci, I mean, how did you? You're coming from different disciplines. How did you go about designing the exchange? I'm interested in your thoughts on how that focus on a global challenge was helpful or not, and really more specifically, some of the small C challenges that you faced in putting this together.
Well, I think you did a great job matchmaking, and sorry for the dating analogy, but we were very compatible pretty quickly on in our work styles, Sammie and I, and I'm really blessed to have her in my professional life. And it's just been a great experience. And I think the students ultimately really, once you have this sort of strong faculty partnership, you're also modeling to your students the kind of cooperation that you're hoping that they can explore through their projects. But I think, I really, sorry, what was the question again? I just got lost. I apologize.
No, that's okay. How did how did you go about designing?
Oh, right.
Yeah,
okay,
the
sorry, I was
virtual
just
exchange.
so excited that it went so well. No, I think it was really important for my student. I'll speak from the criminal justice major side. We are not the most internationally focused program in general. Criminal justice systems tend to operate at the national level. We have a lot of problems with our criminal justice system in this society, and there's a for good reason, good focus on what's going on here. So I knew that my students may not have had, other than through the general education, which is wonderful here, but they may not necessarily be internationally focused sort of naturally and so on. And so I really saw this exchange as a really good one, because we wouldn't have like issues around language to be a further sort of fear factor. Because students were already a little bit nervous or anxious about potentially like having to collaborate for a grade with somebody who's, 6,000 miles away, and do it all virtually, and it to be a good product that they can feel proud of. So I think it was a really good step for the students that were in my discipline. So I was really, when I was working with Sammie, really excited to design something that was accessible to my students, that would get them excited about cross-cultural exchange. COIL is really good for accessibility. It's allowing students that may not otherwise naturally gravitate towards traveling or may not have had those opportunities to have the experience virtually, which is going to reach more students than we can do in a traditional study abroad. So it was a great opportunity. And I think the language part, for my students anyway, was a relief, actually. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be pushed to do other kinds of exchanges, but in my case, because of the lack of international experience in general, that was a real boon. And so we ended up doing, as our culminating assignment, and these are available on the Barzinji website, a couple samples, our students did a podcast in small groups that they recorded, and it sounds actually, they were pretty professional about it. So, and so I'm gonna leave it to Sammie to tell us a little bit about why the podcast came to be, because it was an interesting aspect of the exchange, that was our assignment.
Yeah, so I think when we first kind of got matched, as it were, I'd also hoped in a similar way to how Staci mentioned she wanted an actual scientist to talk about climate change. I'd found that when I teach my students about kind of the physical geography side of climate change, so how rainfall is going to change, how sea level will change, they would then be asking me questions like, well, whose fault is it? Who do we blame? How do we fix this? And as, I'm a mathematician by background, so I definitely can't answer those kind of questions about humans and those sort of things. So being matched with Staci was excellent. When I first found out who she was, I got the name through, Googled her, and was like, oh, this is going to be brilliant. And then thought, well, how on earth are we going to match these things together? Because those classes are so different. But it just worked very naturally. So whatever magic you worked in putting the pairs together, I think when we first were put on a Zoom together and we were put in a breakout room together and given a question to discuss, and we didn't discuss it at all, we just jumped straight in and got really excited about the assignments and everything else. So I think even though we didn't have the language issue, I think the difference between the two education systems really helped the way that we had to shape the class, because the podcast was something that existed already in my class, and because of the way that UK classes are kind of built and approved, sometimes a lot of things are locked in quite early, way before the academic year has started. So by the time we knew we were doing this exchange, I already knew I had to do those assignments, at least with my students. And luckily, Staci was incredibly flexible and also excited about this idea, which meant that we could build those assignments so we could actually have the students working together, which was great, because the podcast was just such a fun thing to do. And I would, again, encourage you to go listen to them because they did an amazing job. I was super impressed.
And by the way, I should say, because you're being too modest about it, that the US Presidential Special Envoy on Climate, John Kerry, listened to those podcasts. You do know that, though. Yes.
My students were quite
you're
overwhelmed.
That was a highlight.
So kudos on that front. And one of the other things that was specific about this award is that you, of course, you were working together directly, but you were part of a greater cohort. And that cohort met, once a week, right? And that or sometimes not every week, but quite regularly. And it included university administrators. So I want to ask both Veronica, but first Sammie and Staci, what you felt were the advantages of having that wider cohort doing the design at the same time, and having the non-academics in there as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great model. So Eunice was one of my administrators. Everyone knows Eunice here. And I also had Karin Lucas, who used to run the Teaching and Technology Center here. And so it was a great team, and I was really glad to work with them. And I think it made sense. I mean, Karin, I'm not the most technically savvy person. I'm not terrible. I'm somewhere average. But anytime I had a tech problem, I had Karin. And then Eunice is really just good with relationships and networking. And I try to model myself after him. I'm just watching and observing, because he does a wonderful job getting to know people and making them feel special. And I look up to that.
Yeah, I think on the Cardiff side, I should definitely highlight my colleague Andre Duploy. Again, on the technical aspect, and when we were trying to work out how we do this with two different learning management systems and all the difficulties that can come with that, he just came up with so many good solutions and was just an excellent ear to run a lot of things by. So very grateful to him. In terms of having that cohort as well, I think that was very useful, because there were two other people working at British University. So we did have some kind of chats about how our experiences may be slightly different to on the US side, and certainly when we had our exchange visit. So I was fortunate to come to Shenandoah last year, and then I talked to Jonathan and Amal, who were the other two British professors doing the exchange, and said, oh, how were your visits? How are you dealing with hosting people in the UK? Because we were all part of very large institutions. So when I came to Shenandoah, it was wonderful. I felt like I met everyone in the university and everyone was really friendly. But I couldn't then take Staci to meet our Vice Chancellor at Cardiff, because I've never met him and most of my colleagues never have. So it was really good to have people who were coming at it from a similar perspective, even if it was different disciplines. We were all still trying to navigate these big, unwieldy university systems. So to know that other people were doing that and coming across similar struggles, I think was incredibly helpful for me.
So, thank you. So Veronica, from the perspective of the trainer, I know this is something when we first discussed the format, right, of this award and the training, this was something that you and your colleague Robin Helms at ACE, were very clear about, not the fact that the training would take place in a cohort and it would include the university administrators. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about your experience generally of that kind of training.
Sure. Yeah, and I can speak also specific to some of the nuances that are between the U.S. and U.K. Because you did start off by saying we have a common language, but certainly we do not have the common systems and the teaching methods and institutional culture. So, in fairness, with this cohort in particular, we had one of the three UK institutions had prior exposure, and all three US institutions had exposure to VE COIL. So there was already this balance, right? I should say imbalance within the group. But it was important as a cohort for them to be able to help those that had previous experience, to help those that were just getting started with some ideas, right? To start it up. We're all about trying to sustain the programs, or not one and dones, and we know that we can't lean completely on faculty to do everything. As you heard before in previous panel sessions about time differences and technologies, that is where it's really key and essential to, right from the start, get involved. The Centers for Teaching Excellence of those equivalent offices, if you have them on your campus. We call them instructional designers here in the United States, but we know they carry different terms. This is just, again, a holistic approach of trying to build community, building collaboration within your own institution, so you're feeling like you're not doing it by yourself. In the UK and US example, this cohort compared to my other work, one of the things I wanted to note is that in the beginning, there was a lot of preconceived notions about what was virtual exchange and COIL. This really influenced the administrators' expectations and their perspectives when they were coming into the lab. But as the lab went on, administrators from both sides started to kind of move past these notions and really explore really creative ways to build curricular internationalization, but also build on this as a stepping stone towards other engagements as partners. There were challenges. We did see that in particular for the UK administrators, many of them hadn't previously worked with these different offices within their university to support faculty teaching. So this is, again, about institutional culture and organizational structures, very much. And having a cohort that you could tap that could either relate or compare differences, I think was really important for really brainstorming and ideating. How do we get past this and making sure we can maintain this beyond the scope of the grant?
We used to joke, Veronica, you and John would joke with us at the commission that we were also having our own COIL, right? Because of, yeah, it was because we were, we again, but most of my colleagues, I mean, I'm American, but I live in the UK, but most of my colleagues are all British. And so, there were these, there are, without doubt, it's not just that there are institutional differences, there are cultural differences as well. And I wonder, just to follow up a bit on that, I mean, you obviously had come off doing some COILs with Norway and Japan, and are there any particular sort of British things that make the COIL with the UK distinctive and different from those two countries that would be interesting to ponder?
I actually relate, I think the US is a little bit of an outlier in this sense because we have, and so I'll start here. One of the things you indicated was just about making changes to the syllabi and needing months, or excuse me, a year in advance approval process. The same can be said in Japan, the same can be said in Norway. So if anything, there's a lot of commonalities in this issue that can pose a challenge for faculty who need to make changes or pivot from their plans. So the workaround that we've been trying to really find, we've been noticing a pattern for solutions that I think would relate if I had to do we'll do it again with the second cycle award, will be to really lean on the administration for thinking about to what depth of detail do you need to articulate in advance what's going to be on the syllabi? Because I recognize that in the contrast to the US, we can be general to a certain extent, but in the UK sense, what we felt is that's a contract pretty much that you're making with the students. So if you're going to even deviate slightly from a very specific activity, there needs to be a review process. So focusing in on the dean level, their department level leaders right now is our new shift in the way we do our training and getting them involved. So beyond just the online professional development, one thing we've been doing with Norway is that we've also been going to the campuses and visiting after the professional development piece and meeting with stakeholders that weren't in our program, but making them aware of this work, bringing visibility to the faculty, bringing visibility to the students, but also bringing visibility to the larger big picture of where does their university in this work sit within their country and also global context. And changing the way you speak about this work, which I know we touched upon earlier in Kyle's session, is really pivotal. You literally, like I've learned now that you kind of have to create, I call them the 5 bullets. That's how I've learned to work. So I have 5 bullet statements that I prepare. And depending on who I'm going to meet with, whether it's the president, the provost, an external sponsor, whatever it is, I learned how to articulate the key elements that relates to what they do on a daily basis. How does this translate to helping them with their work? And I hope that with time and with enough exposure to information, that we'll see some cultural shifts in these systems where there can be built-in flexibility, specifically understanding that this is the very nature, the very essence of the characteristics that we're trying to invoke in our students. In order to really be in the real world and face challenges, you need to be able to deal with the unknown. So that needs to be reflected in the syllabi in a way that still honors awareness and still not deception to the students, but makes them recognize this is for this very reason why we need to be in this way flexible in our language, because we want to evoke the skill sets of being able to problem solve, think on your feet. Those characteristics I said we reviewed for in the faculty. So that needs to be at least up front, known in the syllabi, or at least addressed in the registration, even the registrar's office, I would say. Get those conversations going so that there's an awareness of why is this unique? Why is this different? It has to be in the fabric of your mission, your goal. It all kind of all spins together. You can't be just separating it and treating it as the traditional way we've done it before in the contractual basis.
I'm really glad you raised that, because I think some of the feedback we got from the UK participants is that the commission, the Fulbright Commission, needs to do a lot more work up front to do this kind of work as well, and really join up the dots for university leadership in terms of the advantages it's going to bring the university, and also not least in the case of UK universities that, particularly since Brexit, are looking to the US for partnerships. This is a fantastic way to open the door to making those connections and partnerships. As you know, we've been hearing during the day, but that there's so many. It is really of benefit not just to their students, but to the institution and to the institution's network of partnerships in the U.S. And you know, we've got that message loud and clear. So I'm going to move on now to impact. Okay, it was one course, but still there is impact that can be seen. And I want to ask you first, I mean, how do you think having gone through this has made an impact on your teaching?
I mean, this was huge for my professional development as an instructor. So as was mentioned, I ended up being the flexible partner that did the terrifying thing I'd never done in the classroom to accommodate the UK system. The UK hasn't thanked me yet. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's totally fine. It was great. But I was a little terrified to have my students run off and do a podcast, not just a podcast, but do it, virtually over technology. This was not something that was really in my wheelhouse. It felt a little chaotic to me, but that's where the trust in my partner really mattered. We had spent a lot of time talking to each other. I knew that Sammie knew what she was doing. I was confident that she could teach me to help my students do this kind of assignment. And that is exactly what happened. And now I have this new skill that I can do in another classroom. I hope to do it again. I'm still thinking about exactly where. But so that was huge for me. We're not going to write an essay. We're not going to do a PowerPoint slide. We're actually going to produce a little podcast. Awesome.
Yeah. I'm glad you thought I knew what I was doing, because I'm not sure I was always convinced I did. So thank you for the faith in me. But no, I think from my perspective, it did give me confidence to try those new things, because certainly when we did the podcasts, even though I'd done them once before the academic year previous to our COIL, I think that still felt quite innovative and was very different to what my colleagues were doing in a traditional geography program. You go out in the field, you look at some rocks, you write some essays, and I was getting them to make podcasts, and a lot of maybe other faculty thought that was quite radical. And then I said, okay, we're going to do this now online with US students. But yeah, I think it really gave me belief that these things can work, and they're worth, because it is sometimes a struggle to convince people that that's a good idea. It is worth pushing through. And we had a lot of fun. And I think certainly for me, it gave me a lot more chance to interact with my students than I would normally have. And made me realize it was worth putting in the time to do that, because we generally at my institution have quite large classes, so you don't often get to know many students on an individual basis. And now I feel like there are a lot of students that I know really well, and they're adding me on LinkedIn and asking me for references, and that wouldn't normally happen. So I think teaching in those alternative ways has so many benefits that I would definitely continue to try and do these things for sure.
Yeah, can I echo that? I feel pretty close to the students that went through the experience. And one of the comments we got from the students, in general, it was like, this was a huge challenge, but it was worth it. Like, we were uncomfortable at times, but it worked out great in the end, and it was overall a positive for us. But that relationship building, when I see those students on campus, even if they're not my classes anymore, it's like we went through something together. So we're like, oh, hey, it's great to see. Like, there's more emotion behind that. So it's really good for cultivating professor-student relationships, and also this relationships, that we intend to cultivate among the students from the two countries.
So it's really good to hear about those students, because I think, as you know, I mean, there was one of the participants had problems with her students. This was at a big UK university. Not all of them, some of them just thought, well, why do I need to do anything international? I'm not here to do that. I'm here to do what the course says, forget this international business. And I know that some of the sessions have talked about, how do you make the point to students that this is really, to be a global citizen is a real positive today. It's going to help you in life. And I wonder if the impact on the students, if you can talk to that in terms of their sort of changed perhaps horizons or skills, indeed, the sort of global learning skills, global competencies.
Sure. Yes, and we're still working through our assessment data, but Vicki Spencer in one of the prior panels mentioned the pre and post COIL survey that we do here at Shenandoah. And so we've pulled our data from that larger survey and we're working through it. But clearly the students are moving in the direction of gains. Like nobody is moving backwards as a result in terms of their own sense of confidence and their own sense of their skill set. So it's just, that's unanimous. And of course, the intensity of that and how long it lasts, we really can't tell from the kind of data we're collecting. I say as a social scientist, like there are some, issues with making too bold of claims, but it's definitely moving in a wonderful direction. And when we put that with the qualitative, then we see, yes, this is doing something. And, we're listening to some of the obstacles and the challenges that come up, but we're also recognizing that for the most part, this is like, why are we not doing this like in every classroom? Because we're really seeing the results. Students particularly Sammie's students had a level of confidence. So this is what I thought was interesting on the question of how would you rate your ability to communicate and collaborate with people from diverse backgrounds? It's one of the questions. And Sammie's students in particular scored themselves beforehand pretty high in the confident or very confident sort of mode. And my students were mostly confident. I had some of them saying that they were a little, nervous or not so confident. But everybody moved forward wherever they started. There was nobody that sort of answered later and said, oh, now I have less confidence, because it was, I felt uncomfortable and it was a big disaster. Nobody went backwards in their own sort of mental space. And I think that's really, really important, that the confidence building, we talk about imposter syndrome. We have a lot of first-gen students here who might not envision themselves as somebody that can, talk to somebody and do this like high-level podcast program, podcast assignment with some, they may not have seen themselves in the role of doing this, but they did it. And that's really, really important. And we worked together after the COIL to put language into their resumes. How do we, it was my best guess because we don't really have a standard for this situation, but we kind of together collaborated, like here's a line that you can put on your resume that you did this thing, because employers want that collaboration across cultures. They want all of that. And I think the other thing that our data really is starting to show, and we have more to look at, is it doesn't matter where you start. So if you ever, I don't know if anybody's ever made the argument that, I already know how to do this, therefore I have no gains to be made. Everybody grew, right? Whether they started when they were already really confident or maybe a little less so, everybody had a benefit. So really we can't take that as an excuse either, that, we're already doing that in some other way, or, we already have global students. Growth mindset. There are new horizons, and this can be one of them.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of my students, that's probably covered it very nicely, but just to add on some kind of individual conversations I had, I think that were quite enlightening for me. I know certainly when things were difficult during the COIL, because there were sometimes points where the students weren't sure how to communicate, even though my students were apparently very confident, they did find that quite hard when it actually came to do it in practice, and things around, we've mentioned it a lot today, the time difference. And they come to me and they were like, Sammie, this is really hard. Why are you making us do this? And I would say, well, you did actually opt in because I have a big class, so they didn't all have to do it. They did choose to do the COIL. But in all seriousness, I said to them, just remember, write down what these challenges are. And then when you solve them and you ultimately produce the product that we're aiming towards, these podcasts, then that is, again, it's a line for your CV. Or when you have an interview for a job and they say, tell me about a difficult situation you're in with a team, then you've got a perfect example and you can swing that around and say, look, it was difficult, but now I have international experience. I've done this kind of thing. So I think in that sense, they definitely grew a lot and got to have those kind of experiences that you wouldn't get from a traditional kind of lecture and essay class. And certainly talking to them one-on-one, their confidence did grow. And the special presidential envoy listening to the podcast, like they were coming into my office and say, I've told my mum about this. I don't tell her about university work, and she's really proud. So that was, I think it was a really big deal for them to have this kind of product they can actually show to their families as well and understand what they're learning about university.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to give a final question to Veronica and then open it to the floor for a few questions. But Veronica, from your perspective, because you, of course, did the training here, but you've done them with other COILs between the US and other countries, and I'm really interested in your assessment of the impact on institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So just echoing some points here, again, just to reiterate some things that I wish we could speak more about in the United States, and I hope in the United Kingdom too, is that both countries have really incredibly diverse student populations. And your mention before of international students and part-time attendees earlier referenced and first-generation scholars, we're starting to just see the trickling in of research about how this impacts these demographics, both in the United States and I hope also in the UK there is some emerging research coming out. So to me, this is like a gold mine for really thinking about cross-cultural exchange and global engagement, but also building domestic unity and trying to mitigate polarization in our own country context. In the institutional aspects, what we're noticing is, again, that structuring, the policies that I mentioned before at the curriculum level, but also more broadly of how campuses interact with one another. How do offices that hadn't previously had any reason to really think about teaching are now suddenly thinking about it? Because to me, this isn't isolated as a teaching pedagogy. This is, as you heard before, also a research pedagogy. And getting to align with institutional goals, this work, it's beyond international education, in my opinion. This is just going to be the future of how we teach, learn, and research, whether it's adding in the I in COIL or not. So this is, to me, we're seeing small but significant reports of new positions being created, institutes being dedicated to this field. We're seeing general education requirements evolve to incorporate virtual exchange and COIL and just global learning as a whole, as a notion that is really, I think, a really strong and important piece to reflect on. And we're seeing presidents prioritize, even though internationalization, it was speculated before, is coming under attack, I think that if we're driving this, again, from a socioeconomic perspective, that this is very much an affordable option, a way to increase access and opportunities for all learners, and not just in the student level, but I'm talking about our faculty as well. This is creating professional development and benefiting in the workforce development piece, which certainly higher education is really struggling as a whole to justify, right, the value of a degree program. So to me, virtual exchange and COIL is now a benefit, something that can be a way to help innovate and transform the way we do our work in the higher ed sector as a whole. It's just a matter of time, I think, and a matter of robust data coming out across disciplines. The interdisciplinarity of this work too is significant. We haven't seen any of our scholars actually that have went to try for publication in a journal, whether it's within their discipline. Most of these discipline journals are really thirsty for something new, something different, and they're taking it on, so that's very helpful. And we're seeing governments commit more funding, as we heard from Malaysia, the ASEAN region in general, the Middle East, North Africa, the EU. I'd say one of the last ones at the government level to really kind of directly commit, and maybe that's coming in the pipeline soon, I hope, is the United States. But we are seeing private sector entities rise up. The Fulbright Commission with the UK is certainly a significant pilot. We're hoping to see other commissions also adapt to this modality. So again, it's normalizing. I see this impact of this work really normalizing online exchange the significance of global learning, global competencies rising up, meeting the needs of our employers. So yeah, I think we're on the precipice of seeing something more in this field to come.
Well, that's really encouraging and hopeful conclusion and vision for the future, Veronica. And I just want to reinforce that from our perspective, of course, we're very small, but the fact that the UK government has made this year-on-year commitment to funding 3 pairs of virtual exchange awards is saying something, and I think that's terrific, as is Carnegie Corporation of New York.